May 13th, 1940. 4:15 in the afternoon, and General Charles Huntsiger stands in his headquarters at Sedan, France, staring at a military map that shows his Second Army holding a supposedly impenetrable sector of the French defensive line. What Huntsiger cannot possibly know, what no French general could imagine despite years of military planning, is that at this very moment, German panzer columns are pouring through the Ardennes forest, just miles from his position, emerging from terrain that French intelligence assessments have declared absolutely impossible for armoured vehicles to traverse. The map on Huntsiger's wall, the same map that guided French strategic planning for an entire decade, shows the Ardennes region marked with annotations indicating dense forest, steep ravines, narrow roads unsuitable for mechanized warfare, all leading to the conclusion that became French military gospel. The forest is impenetrable to tanks. This single cartographic assessment, this fundamental misreading of geography and military possibility, represents perhaps the most catastrophic intelligence failure in military history, and within 72 hours, it will allow German forces to punch through the weakest point in France's defences, encircle the best divisions of the French and British armies, and set in motion the collapse of France in just 6 weeks. Marshal Philippe Pétain himself pronounced in 1934 that with special modifications, the Ardennes forest is impenetrable, therefore this sector is not dangerous. And every French war plan since then has been built on this assumption, leaving the Ardennes defended by second-rate reserve divisions with minimal armour and artillery support, while the elite French mechanised forces race north into Belgium, exactly as German planners intended. The French obsession with defensive fortifications begins in the aftermath of World War I, when a generation of French officers who survived 4 years of trench warfare vow never again to allow German armies to ravage French territory. The casualties prove so staggering, more than 6 million French soldiers killed, wounded or missing, that France emerges from the war both victorious and traumatized, determined to prevent any repeat of the slaughter. André Maginot, a French politician who served in the trenches and carries the wounds to prove it, champions the construction of an enormous defensive system along the Franco-German border, a line of underground fortifications so powerful that no German army could break through by direct assault. The French government, viewing the Maginot Line as insurance against another German invasion, spends 7 billion francs over 11 years constructing 142 large artillery forts, 352 fortified gun emplacements, and 5,000 smaller bunkers and pillboxes, stretching from Switzerland to the Belgian border. These fortifications represent the most advanced military engineering of their time, with thick concrete walls designed to withstand the heaviest artillery bombardment, underground barracks and supply depots allowing garrisons to hold out for months under siege, retractable gun turrets that pop up to fire and then disappear back into armoured housings, and even air conditioning and recreation facilities to keep the troops comfortable during extended deployments. But the Maginot Line has a critical gap, extending only as far north as Mont-Medi near the southern edge of the Ardennes forest, leaving over 100 miles of frontier essentially unfortified. French military planners make this decision deliberately, based on 3 assumptions that will prove catastrophically wrong. First, they assume that Belgium will remain a military ally, allowing French forces to deploy on Belgian soil at the first sign of German aggression. Second, they believe that the heavily urbanised areas of northern France and Belgium provide natural obstacles that will slow any German advance. Third, and most fatally, they conclude from studying military maps and terrain assessments that the Ardennes forest itself represents an impassable barrier to modern mechanised forces. The assessment of the Ardennes as tank-proof terrain comes from French military intelligence officers who studied topographical maps showing a region of dense forest, steep hills, narrow winding roads, and numerous rivers that would need to be bridged by any advancing army. These officers, trained in the static warfare of World War I, where a few miles of advance could take months of fighting, cannot imagine how modern mechanised forces might overcome these obstacles quickly. The maps they rely on accurately depict the terrain, showing elevations, road networks, forest density, and water obstacles. But the interpretation of this data reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what German armoured doctrine can accomplish. French tank theory, developed in the 1920s and 1930s, views armour as infantry support, with tanks advancing at walking pace alongside foot soldiers, needing extensive logistical support and frequent maintenance stops. Looking at the narrow roads through the Ardennes, French planners calculate that moving significant armour through the forest would require days or even weeks, giving French forces ample time to counterattack and destroy any German columns foolish enough to attempt the passage. Marshal Pétain, the hero of Verdun and France's most respected military figure, personally endorses this assessment, telling subordinates that the Ardennes terrain makes it a naturally fortified sector, requiring only light defensive forces. General Maurice Gamelin, who serves as French commander-in-chief when war begins in 1939, accepts Petain's judgment without question, drafting the Dial Plan, which commits France's best mechanized divisions to racing north into Belgium the moment Germany attacks, leaving the Ardennes sector defended by second-rate reserve units with minimal anti-tank weapons. The maps showing the Ardennes become a kind of strategic comfort blanket for French military planners, physical evidence that geography itself protects this sector, allowing them to concentrate resources elsewhere. What French intelligence fails to appreciate, what their map analysis cannot reveal, is that German military thinking has evolved in directions that make French assumptions obsolete. Heinz Guderian, the German general who pioneers panzer tactics, views tanks not as infantry support, but as independent strike forces capable of rapid, deep penetration into enemy territory, exploiting breakthrough points before defenders can react. Guderian studies the same maps of the Ardennes that French planners examine, but he sees opportunities where they see obstacles, recognizing that while the roads are narrow and winding, they do exist and can be used if German forces move with sufficient speed and aggression. German staff officers conduct detailed planning exercises simulating an advance through the Ardennes, timing how long it would take armoured columns to traverse the forest if they moved day and night without stopping, for the lengthy maintenance procedures French doctrine requires. The German calculations show that, if panzer divisions use every available road simultaneously, if infantry divisions march alongside them using forest trails instead of waiting for vehicle transport, if engineers position bridging equipment at key river crossing points before the advance begins, then German forces can exit the Ardennes onto open French terrain in less than 3 days. This speed, this acceptance of logistical chaos in exchange for operational tempo, represents thinking so alien to French military doctrine that French intelligence officers discount it as impossible when they receive reports of German training exercises practicing exactly these techniques. The French army in 1940 still relies on telephone lines and motorcycle couriers to transmit orders from headquarters to frontline units, a system that works adequately in static defensive operations, but collapses completely when trying to respond to German armour advancing 50 miles per day. The German war plan that emerges from Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein's strategic thinking in late 1939 deliberately exploits French assumptions about the Ardennes, turning France's map-based confidence into a death trap. Manstein, serving as Chief of Staff to Army Group A, finds himself dissatisfied with the initial German invasion plan, which calls for a straightforward drive through Belgium and Holland, essentially repeating the Schlieffen plan from World War I. Manstein recognises that the French and British expect exactly this approach, that they have positioned their best forces to counter it, and that fighting the decisive battle in Belgium will result in a bloody stalemate, similar to the trench warfare of 1914 to 1918. In October 1939, Manstein drafts an alternative proposal, shifting the weight of the German armoured thrust to the upper Meuse River near Sedan, precisely where the Ardennes forest meets the weakly defended hinge between the Maginot Line and the forces preparing to advance into Belgium. Manstein's plan, called Sichel-Schnitt or Sickle Cut, envisions 10 panzer divisions bursting out of the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River before French reserves can intervene, and then driving northwest toward the English Channel to trap the entire Allied left wing in a massive pocket. When Manstein presents this plan to Adolf Hitler in February 1940, the Führer immediately grasps its brilliance, recognizing that it offers not just tactical advantage, but the possibility of decisive victory that could knock France out of the war in weeks rather than years. Hitler orders the plan implemented, despite objections from more conservative generals who consider it too risky, who worry that concentrating so much armour in the Ardennes leaves German forces vulnerable if the French discover the operation and counterattack, while German columns are still threading through the forest bottlenecks. The execution of the Ardennes operation requires German staff work of extraordinary precision, solving logistical problems that French planners consider insoluble. Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A, tasked with the main thrust through the Ardennes, comprises 45 divisions including 7 panzer divisions and 3 motorised infantry divisions, totalling over 1,500 tanks and 41,000 vehicles that must somehow squeeze through road networks that French maps show as inadequate for such massive movement. German planners identify every possible route through the Ardennes, assigning specific roads to specific divisions, creating detailed movement schedules that specify when each unit should reach each checkpoint, establishing traffic control points at every major intersection to prevent units from different divisions from interfering with each other. The German 19th Panzer Corps, under General Guderian, spearheading the attack towards Sedan, receives the best roads and priority of movement, with 3 panzer divisions advancing in column down routes that wind through Luxembourg and the Belgian Ardennes. German infantry divisions, instead of waiting for vehicle transport, receive orders to march on foot alongside the armour, using forest trails and secondary roads, moving fast enough to keep pace with tanks despite travelling without motorised transport. This requires German soldiers to march 25 to 30 miles per day through difficult terrain while carrying full equipment, a pace that French planners consider impossible for infantry to sustain. German combat engineers position bridging equipment at every river crossing along the planned routes before the invasion begins, allowing panzer columns to cross water obstacles with minimal delay. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photograph every mile of the routes German forces will use, identifying potential bottlenecks and defensive positions that might slow the advance, while Luftwaffe bombers receive orders to suppress any French forces attempting to block the roads once the invasion begins. The deception plan that accompanies the Ardennes operation proves as important as the logistics, deliberately reinforcing French beliefs about where the main German attack will come. Army Group B, under General Fedor von Bock, positioned opposite Belgium and Holland, comprises 29 divisions, including 3 panzer divisions, enough strength to appear threatening, but actually serving as a diversion. Hitler orders Army Group B to begin its attack first, launching airborne assaults and armoured thrusts into Holland and Belgium on May 10, 1940, creating exactly the crisis that French planning anticipates. As French intelligence receives reports of German parachutists landing in Holland, of panzers crossing the Dutch frontier, of Luftwaffe bombers striking Belgian airfields, General Gamelin orders the Dial Plan activated, sending France's best mechanised divisions racing north into Belgium to establish defensive positions along the Dial River. This is precisely what German planners want, pulling the strongest Allied forces away from the real point of attack, while they remain convinced that stopping the German advance through Belgium represents the decisive battle. Meanwhile, opposite the Maginot Line fortifications, Army Group C, under General Wilhelm von Lieb, conducts aggressive demonstrations, firing artillery salvos and conducting limited probing attacks that convince French garrison commanders that a major assault on the fortifications is imminent, pinning down the 41 French divisions manning or backing the Maginot Line. The French army finds itself positioned exactly where German planners want it, with elite mechanised forces committed to Belgium, reserve units defending the Maginot Line, and only second-rate divisions with minimal anti-tank capabilities holding the Ardennes sector that everyone assumes is safe. The moment when German armour begins emerging from the Ardennes onto French soil represents the instant when map-based assumptions collide catastrophically with reality, when French commanders realised that everything they believed about the impassability of the forest was wrong. German panzer columns enter the Ardennes on the morning of May 10, 1940, immediately after Army Group B's attack on Belgium begins, and French intelligence initially dismisses reports of German activity in the forest as minor probing operations or reconnaissance in force. The handful of French cavalry units patrolling the Belgian Ardennes, equipped with obsolete tanks and lacking anti-tank guns, quickly find themselves overwhelmed by German armoured columns that appear in far greater strength than French doctrine says should be possible. These French cavalry units send frantic radio messages back to headquarters, describing German panzers advancing in numbers that seem impossible, reporting that entire panzer divisions are somehow moving through terrain that the maps say cannot accommodate such forces. But these reports arrive at French headquarters where staff officers, steeped in the doctrine that the Ardennes is impassable, interpret them as exaggerations born of panic, unable to accept that their fundamental strategic assumptions might be wrong. General Gamelin, receiving intelligence summaries on May 11th indicating German armoured activity in the Ardennes, concludes that this must be a secondary operation, perhaps a raid or a diversion designed to pull French reserves away from the main battle developing in Belgium. The possibility that the Ardennes thrust represents Germany's main effort, that 10 panzer divisions are converging on Sedan in the greatest concentration of armour yet seen in warfare, simply does not register with French commanders, who have spent years studying maps that tell them this cannot happen. The German advance through the Ardennes proceeds with a speed that shatters every French assumption about the pace of mechanised warfare, demonstrating that when doctrine prioritises tempo over logistics, when commanders accept chaos and confusion as the price of momentum, armoured forces can accomplish feats that seem impossible on paper. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, leading the advance towards Sedan, covers the entire distance from the German border to the Meuse River in just 3 days, a rate of advance that German planners themselves considered optimistic. The narrow roads through the Ardennes do create bottlenecks exactly as French maps predict, with German columns occasionally backing up for miles when a single vehicle breaks down or when bridge construction takes longer than scheduled. But German units simply bypass these obstacles instead of waiting for them to be cleared, with tanks driving through forests and fields when roads become too congested, with engineers constructing improvised bridges, while lead elements ford rivers at shallow points, with traffic control officers ruthlessly prioritising panzer divisions over infantry and supply units. The result is organised chaos, with German supply lines stretched to breaking point, with many infantry divisions falling behind the armour, with command and control degraded by the rapid advance. But Guderian understands that maintaining momentum matters more than maintaining order, that reaching the Meuse River before French reserves can deploy will decide the campaign regardless of logistical confusion in the rear. French aerial reconnaissance finally photographs the massive German columns threading through the Ardennes on May 12th, with pilots reporting traffic jams stretching for dozens of miles along forest roads, presenting what should be a perfect target for Allied air power. But the French Air Force, suffering from obsolete aircraft and dispersed bases that German bombing has already hit, cannot mass enough bombers to significantly impact the German advance, while Luftwaffe fighters provide continuous cover over the columns, shooting down most French reconnaissance aircraft that venture into the area. General Charles Hunziker's Second Army, defending the Meuse River sector around Sedan, with reserve divisions that have minimal training and equipment, receives orders on May 12th to prepare for a major German attack, but has no comprehension of what is about to hit them. Hunziker commands divisions composed largely of older reservists, men in their 30s and 40s called up when war began, who have received only basic training and lack the weapons needed to stop modern armour. The 55th Infantry Division and 71st Infantry Division holding the Meuse River crossings at Sedan possess only a handful of 25mm anti-tank guns, weapons that can barely scratch German panzer armour, while their artillery consists mostly of World War I vintage 75mm field guns that lack armour-piercing ammunition. These divisions occupy defensive positions along the river that French planners considered adequate when they assumed the Ardennes would delay any German advance for weeks, giving time for reinforcements to arrive. But Guderian's panzers reach the Meuse on May 12th, just 2 days after entering the Ardennes, and German commanders immediately begin preparing to force a crossing the next day, not waiting for the infantry and heavy artillery still struggling through the forest bottlenecks. The German assault plan calls for Luftwaffe dive bombers to suppress French defensive positions, while combat engineers rush assault boats and pontoon bridges across the river, under covering fire from tank guns and artillery firing from the eastern bank. French doctrine says that a defended river line can hold out for days or weeks against unsupported armour, that infantry must cross first to establish bridgeheads before tanks can follow. But German doctrine says that speed matters more than method, that if armour can cross quickly, even at heavy cost, the operational advantage of being across the river before French reserves arrive justifies the casualties. The Battle of Sedan on May 13, 1940, demonstrates with brutal clarity how French map-based assumptions about defensive warfare have become obsolete in the face of German combined arms tactics and aerial superiority. The German assault begins at 7 o'clock in the morning, with Luftwaffe dive bombers striking French positions along the Meuse, wave after wave of Junkers Ju-87 Stukas screaming down to deliver 500-pound bombs on French bunkers and artillery positions, while the distinctive howl of their sirens terrorises French soldiers who have never experienced sustained aerial attack. For 8 hours, the Luftwaffe maintains continuous pressure on the French defenders, with bombers attacking in relays that give French soldiers no respite, destroying communication lines, suppressing anti-tank guns, and creating casualties that overwhelm French medical services. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, with French defensive positions battered by hours of bombing, German combat engineers begin crossing the Meuse in rubber assault boats, while tanks on the eastern bank provide direct fire support, their high-velocity guns destroying French bunkers that survive the aerial bombardment. The 55th Infantry Division, composed of reservists who joined the army only months earlier, finds itself under simultaneous attack from the air, from across the river, and soon from German infantry who establish small footholds on the western bank and immediately begin expanding them. By nightfall on May 13th, German forces have secured multiple crossing points and are ferrying tanks across the Meuse on pontoon bridges, exactly what French doctrine says should take days or weeks to accomplish. Hunziker, receiving reports of the German breakthrough, orders counterattacks by what little armour he has available, but these piecemeal attacks arrive too late and in insufficient strength to push the Germans back across the river. The attempt by French and British forces to counterattack the German breakthrough demonstrates how completely the initial intelligence failure regarding the Ardennes has disrupted Allied military operations, leaving commanders reacting to crises instead of executing coherent strategy. On May 15th, Churchill flies to Paris to meet with French political and military leaders, finding Gamelin standing before a map showing German armour pouring through the gap at Sedan, and Churchill asks, "Where is the strategic reserve? The mass of divisions that can be thrown into battle to seal the breakthrough?" Gamelin's answer, delivered in a near whisper, is, "There is none. All available forces have been committed either to Belgium or to the Maginot Line. There are no reserves capable of stopping the German advance." This admission stuns Churchill, who cannot comprehend how France, with over 100 divisions mobilised, can lack reserves to counter the breakthrough. But Gamelin's deployment reflects the fundamental French assumption that the Ardennes sector was safe, that reserves were unnecessary because geography itself protected that front. The British Expeditionary Force and the best French mechanised divisions, trapped in Belgium by the German breakthrough at Sedan, begin retreating toward the Channel ports on May 16th, but German panzers are already racing to cut off their escape routes. Colonel Charles de Gaulle, commanding one of France's few properly organised armoured divisions, attempts counterattacks against the German flanks on May 17th and 19th, briefly disrupting German supply lines, but these attacks lack the strength to significantly slow the German advance, and de Gaulle's division is eventually forced to withdraw before being encircled. The psychological impact of the Ardennes breakthrough on French military and political leadership proves as devastating as the tactical disaster. With the realisation that their entire strategic concept was based on faulty assumptions, leading to a collapse of confidence and will to continue fighting. Premier Paul Reynaud tells Churchill on May 15th that, "We are defeated, we have lost the battle," an assessment that proves premature militarily, but accurate psychologically, as French commanders and politicians conclude that further resistance is futile. Marshal Pétain, the architect of the assumption that the Ardennes was impassable, returns to government service on May 18th as Deputy Prime Minister, bringing with him a defeatist mentality that will lead to the armistice just weeks later. The French army, which fought for 4 years in World War I despite suffering enormous casualties, collapses after 6 weeks in 1940, not because its soldiers lack courage, but because its commanders lack confidence in their ability to stop the German advance. Individual French units fight with great bravery during the Battle of France, with the 4th North African Division defending the Somme River for weeks against repeated German assaults, with infantry divisions at the Maginot Line holding their positions even as France surrenders around them. But these tactical successes cannot compensate for the strategic catastrophe unleashed by the German breakthrough at Sedan, the breakthrough that succeeded because French maps told planners that the Ardennes forest would prevent exactly what happened. The entry of German forces into Paris on June 14, 1940, just 35 days after the invasion began, represents the culmination of a campaign where a single map-based intelligence failure cascades into national catastrophe. The German victory costs approximately 157,000 German casualties compared to 360,000 Allied casualties and nearly 2 million French soldiers taken prisoner. But these numbers only partially capture the magnitude of French defeat. France, considered to possess the most powerful army in Europe before the war, surrenders to a German force that actually has fewer tanks and soldiers than the combined Allied armies, winning not through numerical superiority, but through operational concepts that French intelligence failed to anticipate. Hitler, visiting Paris on June 23, 1940, tours the city and orders that the French surrender be signed in the same railway car at Compiègne, where Germany surrendered in 1918, adding humiliation to military defeat. The Maginot Line fortifications, which absorbed so much French money and planning, fall under German control intact, having never fought the decisive battle they were designed for, because German forces simply went around them through terrain that French maps said was impossible for armour to traverse. The legacy of the Ardennes intelligence failure extends far beyond World War II, fundamentally altering how military organisations approach intelligence analysis and the relationship between terrain assessment and operational planning. The phrase Maginot Line mentality enters military vocabulary as shorthand for defensive strategies that rely too heavily on fixed fortifications and geographic assumptions, while neglecting the possibility that enemies will find ways around obstacles. Professional military education after 1945 emphasizes studying the Battle of France as a case study in intelligence failure, teaching officers to question assumptions, to consider how enemies might use terrain differently than doctrine suggests, to recognize that maps show physical features but cannot predict how human ingenuity and determination might overcome apparent obstacles. The Israeli Defense Forces, studying the 1940 campaign during the 1950s and 1960s, conclude that Arab armies preparing to defend against Israeli attack are making similar mistakes to those made by the French, positioning forces based on terrain assessments that Israeli commanders plan to render obsolete through operational tempo and combined arms tactics. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egyptian forces successfully crossed the supposedly impassable Suez Canal using bridge equipment and infantry assault boats, echoes the Sudan crossing, in demonstrating that determined forces with proper equipment and tactics can overcome water obstacles that planners consider formidable. The technical evolution of military cartography and terrain analysis after World War II reflects lessons learned from the Ardennes failure, with intelligence organizations developing more sophisticated methods for assessing not just what terrain looks like, but how military forces might use it. Modern military mapping incorporates multiple layers of analysis, including cross-country movement analysis, that calculates how quickly different types of vehicles can traverse various terrain, line of sight analysis that determines visibility in fields of fire, trafficability analysis that assesses whether roads and bridges can support military traffic. The development of satellite reconnaissance and digital terrain modeling provides intelligence analysts with far more detailed information about potential battlefields than was available to French planners in 1940. But the fundamental challenge remains the same: interpreting data correctly and avoiding the assumption that enemies will use terrain the same way your own forces would. The United States Army's terrain analysis doctrine emphasizes red teaming exercises, where intelligence officers specifically look for ways that enemy forces might use terrain in unexpected ways, deliberately challenging conventional assumptions about what is possible. The human stories of individual French soldiers and commanders caught by the Ardennes breakthrough illuminate the personal dimension of a disaster usually discussed only in strategic terms, revealing how map-based planning failures translate into battlefield tragedies. Lieutenant Paul de Villume, serving with a reconnaissance unit in the Ardennes on May 10th, sends increasingly frantic reports to headquarters, describing German armour advancing in far greater strength than French intelligence predicted, watching his reports being dismissed by staff officers who cannot accept that their maps might be wrong. General Pierre Lafontaine, commanding the 55th Infantry Division at Sedan, tries desperately to rally his reservists as German assault boats cross the Meuse, knowing that his division lacks the weapons and training needed to stop modern armour, watching his defensive positions being overwhelmed, not through lack of courage, but through lack of proper equipment and support. Thousands of French soldiers fight to the last round before surrendering, confused and demoralised not by cowardice, but by the realisation that their commanders have placed them in impossible positions, defending terrain that intelligence assessments said was safe, but that has become the main axis of German attack. The soldiers of the 71st Infantry Division, ordered to hold the Meuse crossings at all costs, watched German panzers streaming across pontoon bridges, knowing that withdrawal means court-martial, but that staying means death or capture. Trapped by orders based on assumptions that have proven catastrophically wrong, the final assessment of how a single map mistake nearly won World War II for Germany must acknowledge both the magnitude of the intelligence failure and the narrow margin by which it did not succeed in achieving decisive German victory. The French assumption that the Ardennes was impassable to armour was not unreasonable given French military doctrine and the information available on topographic maps, but it reflected a failure to imagine how an enemy with different operational concepts might use terrain in ways French planners considered impossible. The German exploitation of this assumption through the Zickelschnitt plan demonstrated brilliant operational planning, accepting risks that more conservative military leaders would have rejected, trusting that speed and aggression could overcome the logistical challenges that French planners considered prohibitive. The 6-week collapse of France that followed the Ardennes breakthrough changed the entire strategic situation in Europe, leaving Britain fighting alone, allowing Hitler to turn his attention toward the Soviet Union, creating the conditions for the global conflict that World War II became. Yet the German victory in France did not end the war as Hitler hoped, did not force Britain to negotiate peace, did not prevent the eventual entry of the United States into the conflict. The intelligence failure that allowed German forces to break through at Sedan gave Germany a dramatic victory, but not the decisive victory that would have ended the war in 1940. The maps that French planners relied on, showing the Ardennes as difficult terrain unsuitable for rapid armoured advance, were not wrong in their physical details, but wrong in their strategic interpretation, failing to account for how German military innovation would render French assumptions obsolete. The lesson remains relevant today, a reminder that intelligence is not just about gathering information, but about correctly interpreting it, about questioning assumptions, about recognizing that enemies may find ways to accomplish what your own doctrine considers impossible. The map annotations that said impenetrable, that reassured French generals they were safe, became the very annotations that marked the route to disaster, proving that in war, the greatest danger often comes from the threats you have decided are impossible.